Well, welcome today. We're going to start back in where we left off, or approximately where we left off the last class period, and we're going to be looking more in depth at coal in Appalachia because Appalachia has long been associated with coal. The picture that I have up here is, as it says on the bottom, part of the Appalachian Plateau. And as I asked the class before we started today, how do you know this is the Appalachian Plateau and not the Ridge and Valley? And they began to tell me that you know it's the Appalachian Plateau because of the horizontal layer cake characteristics of the sedimentary material. You may recall that bituminous coal is found in Appalachia as well as anthracite coal. And we're going to talk a little bit about bituminous coal first. It's much easier to mine than the anthracite coal because the anthracite coal is associated with the ridge and valley and faulting and extreme dips, meaning that it has a slope to it. Whereas the Appalachian Plateau, instead of sloping, has this horizontal characteristic that means you're going to go right back along the seam into the interior of, for instance, this particular picture, into the interior of the exposed seam. Now you can mine this coal in a variety of ways. We're going to talk a bit about underground mining, and that's a very expensive type of mining. When you're into underground seams, you have to support the overburden. You have to have people underground. You have problems with potential explosions, safety, and so forth. And so there's a tendency, if at all possible, to mine from above ground. And there's a number of ways of doing that. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. Up to 10 foot in thickness, some of these seams are. As you can see, many exposed via erosion or by way of streams. Reserves, we're not going to run out of coal. It's important to recognize the United States in the near future is not going to run out of coal. In fact, we're going to be mining coal, I would suspect, both for our own use as well as for outsiders' use long into the future. And probably will be coal left over when we decide to use some other form of energy rather than coal. 300-year supply at current rates of production. Well, that's a long, long time. I think the most recent thing I saw for Saudi Arabian oil, about 100 years supply. So keep in mind, we have a lot of coal. It's not going to run out. The major market for coal is for steel mills, for electricity, and I would push the electricity, not so much anymore for home heating fuel. But coal is mined for electrical, as well as to some extent for steel production, but primarily today to generate electricity. We export a lot of coal, and in the future we're going to probably be using coal gas. We're going to have extraction of the coal and convert it into a coal gas instead of natural gas, although currently that would be far into the future. We have an adequate supply of natural gas to take care of our needs into the near future, not necessarily into the distant future. As I said, the mining methods are multiple, some being underground through shaft mining and drift mining. If you remember that seam that I had exposed here, drift mining refers to taking a horizontal seam and then putting a shaft back into the mountain from the exposed seam. And that would be drift mining. So you take an exposed seam where you have it and then go backwards into the mountain itself. That's drift mining. Shaft mining is coming down from the surface. So if you will, going from the surface, having a vertical shaft downward and then having horizontal shafts along the seam of coal. So if we were back to this one, you'd come down from the top, go downward till you reach this coal seam, and then mine it from all directions, leaving pillars of coal for support. So you could have shaft mining or drift mining. Both of the two, as I said, fairly expensive. Both of the two, the traditional way of mining Appalachian coal. To reduce the cost of mining, primarily to reduce the cost, to reduce the potential for shaft cave-ins and danger to the miners, they've used surface mining techniques. And with surface mining techniques, you remove the overburden. Now, when you have large amounts of horizontal area, you would use strip mining, where you would cut a series of seams through, or from the surface, you would go downward, exposing the coal seam. That material that you removed to expose the seam, you would throw over to the side, and you would continue then to migrate from one direction across the surface, exposing the seam, taking it out, throwing the overburden back over on the side where you had the hole before. And so strip mining may look like this, and you have these large earth-moving pieces of equipment, these large lines exposing the seam down below here, removing the coal, and then covering the seam. Contour mining is when you have drift, where you have a seam exposed, you follow the contour around, and you just mine the contour exposing so that you do it from the outside going inward. And as the book says, it looks like a layer cake as you go from the bottom to the top, exposing additional seams as you move upward. And then you have mountaintop removal, and that seems to be the most recent item that we have in Appalachia, and it, of course, created the most conflict in the news media amongst the people who are environmentally sound, because what you do is to take a top of a mountain area and you just remove that top, totally remove the top of the mountain, throwing the overburden down into the next valley over here, filling up the valley with overburden, removing the coal seams that are there, exposing it, throwing it back into the valley, and then leaving behind pretty much a total wasteland. People are very opposed to this, but you find that there's quite a bit of mountaintop mining going on in Appalachia today. Very destructive of the environment. I would urge you to read a little bit more about mountaintop mining. You'll find a tremendous amount of material in there because it has created so much conflict. Sometimes they will, if there is a road where you can view this, they will leave exposed the original terrain where people going through would see the original hillside, but behind it they would cut out the mountain and just throw it back into the next valley. Sort of like a decaying tooth where you remove the good tooth, expose it, throw it away. So mountaintop removal. It's cheaper than shaft removal, and that's the key. More profit to be made through that technique. Some of the sort of scenery that you would see with mining, when you would have strip mining, big, massive earth-moving pieces of equipment, taking the coal to the tip hole and removing the overburden. Coal production, east versus west. If you look in your book, you will have a data for, I think, 2006. The data that I have here is only 2002, but it doesn't detract from what it shows. And what you're going to find in your book is the same sort of pattern, and that is that the production of coal is much greater in the West today, and you can see the increasing amounts of coal production from the western United States versus the area of Appalachia. Appalachia remaining constant or going down a bit, but the West really increasing in production since the 1940s up to the present. And you might ask, why did the West increase in production when there was still 300 years of coal left in the country? Why mine the West and not mine Appalachian coal? And the answer has to do with environmental protection and the way the western seams were mined. The western seams often are lower heat content per ton than the eastern coal, but the one thing it didn't have in the West was sulfur. And with low sulfur coal, That kind of coal has less air pollution, less need for scrubbers as you produce thermal electricity, and therefore a greater demand. Therefore, you will take Wyoming coal, and note Wyoming on here, and as you look at Wyoming, note the increase in production in Wyoming, so that Wyoming is a major coal producing state. You would take Wyoming coal, mine it in Wyoming, put it on Burlington Northern trains, or put it on UP trains, ship it all the way to the east to the thermoelectric plants that are along the Mississippi Valley or even further east. Not necessarily to the TVA. The TVA uses more local coal, but other thermoelectric plants along the Mississippi Valley use a rather large quantity of Wyoming coal. And here in Hays, Kansas, line on the UP train track, as we look at the Union Pacific line and look at the train going by, they're almost 100% coal. Everything going by are coal cars going east, full of coal, empty cars going west, getting another load of coal and taking it east. As you look at it, you say, man, there's got to be a lot of electricity being generated with that much coal. And it goes into Kansas, goes further eastward into, as I said, the Mississippi Valley. So coal production over time, east stagnating, west increasing, with Wyoming being the major coal producing state of the west. Tremendous amounts of coal. Multiple seams, one over the top of the other in the area of Wyoming. The Burlington Northern, the UP, owning the coal and having trackage rights to take the coal out of the area of production and move it primarily eastward. Home heating fuel, I told you there's not as much home heating fuel with coal as there was in the past. This comes directly from your text. You'll find that same map there. As you go back to the period of time that we have here, the original item here, which was back, I think, in the 1950s, you look at it and you will see that there was quite a bit of coal being used in home heating. The house I grew up in, although we never had coal, I grew up in Illinois, and we had a room in the house, a particular room in the basement with an opening to the driveway that had coal. It was the area where the coal was stored, and our furnace that had been converted to natural gas initially was a coal-fired furnace, needing coal to provide home heating fuel. Now, as you look at this coal through here and you say, well, what did they use to replace the coal for heating? It's very easy to go down here and you say they used what? Natural gas. Where did the natural gas come from? And the answer is, if you look at natural gas production, if you're from Kansas and you go down to Hugoton, Kansas, down in the southwestern Kansas area and into Texas, you'll note that we have a rather large production of natural gas from that area. And underlying the country are a series of pipes that go this direction, taking the coal or taking the gas from this area and moving it out into the area of the east. Now you'll note already here in the early years we had gas being used in the Great Plains for home heating fuel. But it wasn't used too much out where the population was at. They used coal, and much of this coal then coming from Appalachia. The changeover occurred, as I said, in my youth. I can remember we were on a waiting list for natural gas. I can remember putting in the large natural gas pipelines underground. Here in Kansas, you've seen the pumping stations where they add more pressure to the natural gas to move it out to the east. As you come to this point right here, you will see that we have some fuel oil area out in this area of the country. In other words, if you want to heat your home and you're there in Megalopolis and up into the bypass east, you still need to buy heating oil, and that heating oil is utilized because natural gas pipelines just don't go out to that area, keeping in mind that it's sort of north of where the natural gas would go. Here in the far south, As you look at that, you will see that it's electricity. You might ask yourself, well, what does the electricity come from? And the answer to that is it comes from burning coal in thermoelectric plants or nuclear electric plants, and then shipping the electricity and using that for home heating. So with that in mind, you've got to assume that the coal in this area and the electricity in this area would be cheaper than bringing in the natural gas. As you look westward, you can see that the primary home heating fuel in the country is what? It's natural gas. I've always been concerned in my mind when I see the advertisement for converting your cars to burning natural gas. Because as a homeowner, in my home using natural gas for fuel and having a natural gas furnace in the basement, I would be really concerned if something happened to natural gas. Can you imagine what it would cost to retrofit to another type of fuel when you've got home heating with gas? And as you look at the western U.S., you can see it would have a tremendous impact. Now, I'm not saying we're going to run out of natural gas. We've found some new supplies of natural gas, but in the back of my mind, I'm always concerned about using that natural gas when it's so important for home heating fuel. Questions about this particular map. Notice we have a lot of coal out in this particular area through here, especially focusing on Utah, Carbon County, Utah, and it was significant in the past for home heating. You can see the disappearance here, and by the time you get out to this point, it totally disappeared for home heating. Natural gas or electricity or oil, heating oil. Questions? Kind of a neat series of maps. Much of our coal that we're mining in Appalachia today, that constant production that we have, when you think about all of the reduction in use, and you might say when you look at the production in the East, if we go back to that and you say, well, this is pretty constant. Home heating had gone down. We're no longer having big steel plants. Where is the coal going? And the answer is that much of the coal is put onto trains, the coal trains, and it's shipped to the coast. And it's unloaded at the coast, put into large tipples, and those fill up freighters, and this coal is then shipped to the market in other areas of the world. Sometimes in areas where they don't worry as much about the carbon content of the coal. We tend to have national laws rather than international laws. We don't like to see ourselves as part of a global community, but as you well know, in reality, the world is one world, and we are a community. And if we burn high sulfur coal one place, it's going to pollute the environment the same as it's going to pollute the environment here. It's going to pollute the global environment. But we do export a lot of coal, much of that coal coming from Appalachia because it's so close to the Atlantic Ocean. Main port at Norfolk goes out from the areas of the coal mines, used to be Norfolk and Western, that shipped the coal out. To some extent it still is, and they ship it to Norfolk, and here at Norfolk they will load up the ships and ship them to the market. The anthracite coal, the bituminous was much more widely distributed, much more widely mined. The anthracite primarily came from the Ridge and Valley region of Pennsylvania. Its uses were in home heating. And the reason it was used in home heating is for the same volume of coal, you got a greater amount of heat out of it than you would with bituminous or lignite. So if you had a limited space to store the coal in your house, which most people did, and they didn't want to have trucks of coal coming in any more often than they needed to buy it, they wanted something where you had a constant volume but with a higher heat content per unit volume. So it was used for home heating. It was also used for making of coke, but it was heavily used for home heating. Present use is minimal. We don't use much anthracite at all. The coal fields of Pennsylvania, not used to any great extent. They look like this. This is up in the anthracite landscape. And as you look at this particular infrastructure, you can see it's not utilized to any great extent, meaning the windows being broken out. Landscape left over for the anthracite mining. This is what the anthracite coal looks like. Very hard coal. Like I said, limited marketplace today. What about the impacts of coal mining? As you look at coal mining and you think of coal mining, should we, what are the benefits and what are the negative side? The benefits are it provides employment. Meaning in the short run, most of us are interested in day-by-day money. We do things each day that may not be beneficial for us in the long run, but we think very short run. Some of you may have gone out and eaten a big piece of beef recently with a lot of fat on it and a big order of French fries. And you said, man, I really love that. That took care of my hunger, and I'll do it again. And somebody else says, you're killing yourself. And you say, well, I'll worry about that when the time comes. Right now I'm going to eat. And the people who mine coal say the same thing. They may say, you're going to get black lung disease. You may have a cave-in. You may have an explosion. And they say, well, yes, that is true, but I've got to worry about the bill for next week and feeding my family and having a home and a roof. And if I'm not a coal miner, what am I going to do? What are you going to replace my salary with? So as you think about that, there are reasons that it occurs. And it provides employment. It's an economic mainstay, and people for the work are willing to put up with the downside. The downside are, as I said, the accident, the black lung disease, the stream pollution, the surface disruption. Environmentally, it's sometimes considered to be a disaster, but it provides economic wherewithal for the region. And one of the problems of Appalachia is poverty and needing work. So how do you replace coal mining jobs with something else? That's really the question. Reclamation costs, we tend to put that into the equation. Laws are passed stating that if you're going to remove the overburden in strip mining, you have to put it back, making it look at least somewhat like it did originally. That's very costly. And sometimes the mining companies find that that's too costly for the company to bear. Of course, they come out and lobby against such activities. If you go and talk to coal miners, they might well say, yeah, well, if it means putting me out of work, I'm against it. And you can understand why. Very short run. Pollution costs, sure they're there. You go into Appalachia, look at the stream. This color of the stream did not come from the soil color. It came from runoff, pollution. It's there. It's part of the cost of doing business. Doesn't have to be, but it's part of the cost, because if it doesn't have to be and the costs are too high, you just quit producing it and you have unemployment, and that's pretty negative for the area. Here is you'll notice here, a relocation project. Sometimes these coal seams will catch fire. And if they catch fire, they're very hard to put out. And this particular site of Centralia in Pennsylvania has an underground coal seam that continually is burning. They don't seem to be able to put it out. They're just letting it burn. And they're relocating the people who lived here. So lots of dangers with coal. And again, this is a scene associated with the anthracite mining industry, taken in Pennsylvania anthracite area. Other mining activity, and you may remember I started out by telling you that Appalachian jobs are focused upon primary activities. There is some manufacturing, and we'll talk a bit about that, but much of it is primary. Much of it relates to taking things out of the ground then. And we have the tri-state lead zinc mining area, and this is in the Ozarks. This is in Kansas, over into Oklahoma, and into the area of Arkansas, the tri-state of those areas. The lead that we have there and the mining is associated with was by hot water deposit. It would leaching, the water leached the lead out of the rock and then deposited it as it cooled. This is down in Oklahoma, one of the tipples associated with the lead mining. This particular smelter is gone. This particular smelter was in the town of Galena, Kansas. Galena, Kansas, named after the Galena lead ore. The ore is called Galena. It's a cubical type of ore, sort of a very shiny gray, silvery gray color in cubes. The Eagle Pritchard smelter. And when I was down there, this picture would have been taken in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And you look at the smelter and then you look at the landscape. And this is the landscape of southeastern Kansas near Galena associated with that particular smelter. Mineral production often has environmental consequences. This particular one is gone, but the remains remain on the landscape. In Pennsylvania, you have another product, the first petroleum production in the United States was at Titusville, Pennsylvania. And you may be familiar with these two brands of lubricants. Pennsylvania doesn't produce much oil in terms of oil for converting to gasoline or doing that type of oil production, but what they do produce is very high-grade petroleum, and it's made into lubricants. And you're familiar with Pennzoil, telling you where it comes from, Pennsylvania crude. And of course, it's no accident that if you think of the Quaker state and Quakers, the plain folk from Pennsylvania, again, you have Pennsylvania with the two brands of crude, and the crude being used again in lubricants. So Pennsylvania, Titusville, Pennsylvania, located in the area of Appalachia. So we've got coal, we have oil. Over in Appalachia, we have lead primarily. We have copper and zinc down here at Ducktown, right down here where the arrow is on here. Over here, right there, southern part of Tennessee. And then for industry, not a lot of industry, but some. Some raw material processing, chemical, glass. You'll find this in West Virginia. And we'll talk about the Tennessee Valley here in a moment. Here's an example of the raw material processing. I don't know whether you'd like to have one of those next door to your home or not. But as you look at it, you can see that this one threw out a tremendous amount of pollutants, lots of smoke. Fire back in here, as you see right here in the picture, of smelter. But it provided jobs. That's the key. It provided jobs, and the state laws allowed them to do it there. Enough said about that. Enough said. Another industry, an old industry, is the glass companies in this area, Blinko Glass, taking the silica from the area and converting it, in this instance, into ornamental glasses, into ornamental glass. Sort of a specialty type industry here. If you ever go into Milton, West Virginia, go to some of the glass blowing sites. It's an education in and of itself to see how they do it. Craftsmen, true craftsmen, where they produce that. And then the Tennessee Valley Authority. The book will tell you that this particular project was intimately tied to Franklin Roosevelt and to Franklin Roosevelt's desire to do something with what he perceived was a social problem in America, Appalachia. The poverty of Appalachia, which we said was related to isolation. That's one of the things it was related to, was isolation. But he looked at it, he said this isolation had produced a traditionalism in Appalachia, sort of left behind. Modern America moved out and moved forward, and Appalachia remained stagnant. He was looking for a way to put federal money into Appalachia. And this seems to be the appropriate time to introduce the concept that not everybody likes the federal government kind of nosing themselves into regional activity. In fact, some of you out here in the listening audience may be of a persuasion that you think the less federal government, the better federal government. And as this particular series of lectures are going on, we're having quite a debate on national health care and whether we should have a federal plan or a plan that is not private but public. Well, as you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority, what we're dealing with here is the use of public funds, national funds, to try to funnel into a region. And that's hard to find the sort of justification for this. But Franklin Roosevelt hit upon the idea. And he looked at the Tennessee River and he said the Tennessee River is long enough that we could promote navigation on this river with a series of dams and with being able to sort of, you could say, domesticate this river. Instead of being a wild river, we could then have navigation, and with navigation, we could help the region. We'll do it on the back of navigation because navigation is under the auspices of the federal government. So if you look at the Missouri River and the Mississippi River and interstate commerce, that's federal government. That's not state government. So Roosevelt hit upon that and he said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go in and we're going to increase navigation on the river. Along with this, though, we got to have flood control because those dams have a life expectancy. The more silt that comes into the dam, erosion if you will, the shorter the life expectancy of the dam. So we need to do something to get flood control under control, the flooding that occurs there. We need to take care of the erosion that's taking place. We need to improve agriculture so they no longer have erosion. We need to teach them new ideas in agriculture. Well, that's not hardly navigation, but if you go with the flow, yeah, well, I can understand how that relates to navigation. Well, as you go through these impacts, if you have a dam, why not have recreation on the dam? How many of you would say, well, we've got Webster, we've got Cedar Bluff, we've got Wilson Dam here in Kansas, around Hays, Kansas. That's a nice dam that's used for flood control, and we're going to find it part of the Missouri Valley Project. But if you've got that dam and you've got that big reservoir behind it, why not have some recreation? I think all of you would agree that's a pretty good idea. So, recreation. And then if you've got a dam and a spillway, you might as well generate some power off of it. I mean, why put all that money in without giving something back to the taxpayer? Put in a power supply and that generates income. And of course, if you're generating power, you have to market that power. And if you market that power, that brings in industry. And so as you see this sort of integrative picture that they put together for the TVA, it had an amazing impact upon the Tennessee Valley. All done under the auspices of navigation. Now, this is what it looked like. The Tennessee River begins back up in here. Here's some of the, you can see in Virginia, back into North Carolina, a little bit into Georgia are the headwaters of the Tennessee Valley. The Tennessee comes down through here, around through here, comes back north into Paducah and then into the area of the Ohio River. So as you look at this massive area that the Tennessee Valley was associated with, you can see it was a regional program for the Cumberland Plateau, for the southern part of Appalachia. And its goal was to improve this region, and the TVA is a federal authorized project, not states, but federal. Now, what they got into was producing power, marketing the power, bringing electricity to Appalachia, if you will, by way of hydroelectricity, and I would be amiss if I didn't tell you thermoelectric plants, as well as nuclear plants. So power generation and marketing is today a big aspect of the TVA, along with navigation. Taking care of erosion is a constant item in their sort of recipe of things they do. So the TVA, as you can see, had been a major influence of life in the Tennessee Valley, with more than 40 dams on the area's streams, and the dams are identified, and you can see the lakes behind the dams. And boy, those lakes are beautiful recreational facilities. Bringing in what? Bringing in tourism. So the TVA. Here is one of the dams on the TVA project. The Appalachia behind it, really kind of, I almost can see the Three Gorges Dam on a larger scale down there in southern China, if you will, in the Yangtze. Kind of the same idea. Dam up the river, have navigation, reduce flooding, all the things that go along with dam building. Now this was from an epoch when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in power, the 1940s. Today, not everybody is as enamored with dams as we were at that time. And I need to tell you that there's a great number of people that see these dams as something that should be removed. Not necessarily in the Tennessee Valley, but in other areas of the country, dams are not always seen in positive light, especially in the Pacific Northwest when we're dealing with salmon runs. And the fact that these dams may have a negative impact upon the fishing industry. When we think about impacting Mother Nature, something that looks good has collateral damage, and it can have collateral damage. So, kind of a pretty picture. And then the Appalachian Regional Commission. I would ask you to just sort of Google that one. There's all kinds of things that you'll find on the Appalachian Regional Commission. I have some, I have a number of items in here that I've done it. Let me take this and just see if I can't get a document camera to come down on here. Appalachia, a land with two faces. And this one comes from U.S. News and Report back in 1986. And what the key factor of the Appalachian Regional Commission was all about was highway construction. Trying to improve in Appalachia the amount of isolation that was there and reducing that isolation. Some of the items in here are just amazing to read back then. Let me read this right here. Creatures in the water tap. Many families living outside towns along the Kentucky River pipe water to their homes in the hollows from abandoned mines in the mountains. Some find the water with a sharp mineral taste refreshing. But Kathy Smith, 34 at Tribby, was thankful when her mobile home finally was hooked up to a city line. When you boiled that mine water, an awful yellow skim would come to the top, she says. Sometimes water dogs, salamanders, would clog up the pipe. Thinking about Appalachia, it's kind of an interesting area. I think in this particular article as well, it may talk about Julie Hanshu. Let's see if I can find this. Children born into mountain poverty find it tough to escape. Gordon Sloan, 11, lives on welfare and food stamps with his mother, Bethel Lee Sloan, 34, and 6 siblings. Their home is a 12 by 24 foot, 2-room house, painted yellow and topped with a corrugated tin roof near Caney Creek in Knox County. Standing in the doorway, keeping an eye on a TV set, a shirtless, tow-headed Gordon expresses an interest in math, but then bursts out, "I hate school. When I get to the 8th grade, I'm going to quit." His mother glances over her children and remarks, "Sure, I'd like for them to grow up to be doctors and lawyers." Then without much conviction, she just adds, "I just hope for the best." The Appalachian Regional Commission was put in to, the concept being to, as I said, reduce the amount of isolation with highway construction, thereby bringing in other economic opportunities. And it would be well to look under ARC, Google it, Appalachian Regional Commission, and read a little bit more about it. State and federal cooperation, all of the states of the area bought into it. The state defined the target area and what they hope to do, and federal money being put into local projects. The future for Appalachia, everything I have read suggests the negative. If you want to read an account of Appalachia, I would urge you to get this particular book, Night Comes to the Cumberlands, a biography of a depressed area by Harry M. Caudill. It talks about Appalachia, all the problems associated with Appalachia, how to deal with it.
How recent is that?
That book is back in about the 70s. Things haven't really improved. Haven't really improved all that much. If you're looking about where the improvement is, isolation had been reduced. In-migration has come in, but often it's with vacation sites, second homes, people seeing the environment of Appalachia, it's a pretty place to go to. As I told the class earlier, and not out here in the land of virtual college, the story goes that one grandson left Appalachia for better life. And you might ask, why don't more people leave Appalachia? If it's all that bad, why don't they leave? And the story goes, the grandson went up to Chicago, got himself a job, good paying job, bought himself a car, and he came back to Appalachia. Visited Granddaddy. Granddaddy's sitting out there on the front porch, rocking in a rocking chair, similar to what you'd see at a Cracker Barrel restaurant, those rocking chairs. So you got him out here and he's rocking in the rocking chair. He's looking out over the scenery of Appalachia and the young man telling Grandpa how great it is in Chicago. Now we've talked about the American manufacturing belt and we know they have big roads, we know they have congestion, we know they have crime, they have all kinds of things. And the grandpa looked at him and said, "Well, that may be, son, but the way I look at it, you work 50 weeks a year up there in that hellhole to come down here to heaven to spend 2 weeks with me. I have 52 weeks a year in heaven." And as you think about that, you may say, well, yeah, that's the instilled regional poverty, but keep in mind that if it's that much heaven, why wouldn't people decide to go to Appalachia to live, because today, with many jobs being associated with a computer, all you have to do is put up an office building, and if you have internet and computer access, you can do it anywhere. You're next door to wherever. And so Appalachia is experiencing some positive aspects of growth from the outside coming in. When I've been in Appalachia, you could see the new homes of outsiders coming in, or people who made it, down there in heaven alongside poverty right next door, the locals. So Appalachia is being discovered. And as it's being discovered, they find out the fishing, they find out the wonderful climate that's associated with the sea climate, sort of the mild winters. Sure, it's rainy, but the beauty of the area, and it is attracting people in. It still does have poverty, though, for the locals. One last area that I wanted to cover, it's in the Piedmont. It's not part of the Appalachian Highlands. It's in Pennsylvania. It's outside of Philadelphia. You could almost say it's part of Megalopolis, but I chose to put it in here because it's also part of Appalachia. It's right out there on the edge of the Blue Ridge. It's almost adjacent to Appalachia, and it's an area frozen, somewhat frozen in time. And you might ask, what would produce an agricultural landscape that looked like this? Big homes, massive barns, wonderful looking fields, prosperity, well kept, but it is a unique and distinctive agriculture. Notice the fencing around the homestead. Imagine the amount of work to keep that painted. And the answer is it has to do with a cultural trait. And this cultural trait is religion. And the people who live in Lancaster County are known as the Amish or the Pennsylvania Dutch. And the Amish have a part of their religious beliefs that they should live a simple life without internal combustion engines. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have mechanization, but the principal means of locomotion is the horse. And they have turned their back generally on electricity. And so you lead a fairly simple life, sort of frozen in time when horses were king, agriculture was done by horses, small farms, big families, lots of labor to do the work, and not needing computers, not needing cell phones, not needing all of these modern devices. Therefore, the amount of money they need to survive is kind of reduced. So when you go in there to this area and you go through the rolling hills of the Piedmont, you look at the landscape and you say, well, this is a pretty prosperous agricultural landscape. And indeed it is. It's a beautiful landscape. The barns are big, very, very big. The silos, the cattle, many times they're self-sufficient, almost self-sufficient. As you look at this house, you'll have multiple generations living under the same roof. Grandpa is taken care of by the family. My mother is in a nursing home. I don't have her in my house. But if you lived here, they would take care of the individual there. Now, my mother's cost is quite high per month. You know, at some point it's going to be difficult to provide that kind of money. They, on the other hand, don't have to provide that money because they're caring for the older folk themselves. But it means they have to have these big homes, multiple stories, rooms for people. They used to be called the gay Dutch. Gay has taken on another meaning beside happy and bright and producing all of these nice gayful ornamentation. People have asked him, what does all this mean? And in general, it's just pretties. And you'll find them decorating the barn, sometimes using Teutonic symbols like the tulip and other aspects that harken back to Germany. They lead a simple lifestyle when it comes to dress. In fact, the women will often not have any buttons at all on their dress, but will use straight pins to keep it in place. It's just amazing to be able to imagine that here is a community in the 21st century still living a life that was typical of the turn of the 20th century or the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century. Homespun, quilting, simple dresses, the men having simple, plain folk. You may have heard that for the Amish. They're very much aware of the ability to market their goods and to get money by way of tourism. They have some very interesting names. Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania is right there. You may be able to see on this particular sign, Intercourse, Pennsylvania, which give rise to the signs that Virginia may be for lovers, but Pennsylvania has intercourse. There's always a way to market it and to get down to the base. Intercourse here meant communication, crossroads, the ability to communicate, to have crossroads, if you will, and so they use the term intercourse. You can see the older lady here selling home jellies, things that we take today and we look at and say, maybe they've got the right idea. And so we find many, many people getting back closer to nature, green folk, if you will, people who say, let's have a lower carbon footprint. Well, the Amish have been doing that forever. I would urge you, if you get the opportunity, to go through the area of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. You'll find that these people are not interested in your gawking at them. All they want to do is be left alone and live their life. Some of the pictures I took from a bus as we were going through, I was interested in the one-room schoolhouse. I was very much interested in the fact that although they don't usually have telephones, they're well aware of emergencies. And when this slide was taken, they had one line coming in here, and this is not an outhouse. It was an area where you could get the community telephone. It was under lock and key. You'd go to the elder, get the key, use the telephone in emergency. In other words, very practical people, but they don't necessarily feel they need to have that themselves. I don't know how much money we'd save a month if you removed your cable TV, if you removed your telephone, if you removed your internet access, you don't have an automobile, you do all those kind of things, you don't go to the store and buy Marie Callender food, you cook your own, live close to nature. I don't know how much we'd save, but I guarantee you that's what they do. That's where they're at. I don't know that you can keep everybody into that environment. You might ask, what about the young people? Do they choose to leave? And my suspicion is yes, they do. But there's a great many of them that choose to stay, and the farmland in here, if it comes up for sale, the locals will buy it so there's a place for the children to go back into. So the community is still alive. The cemetery is fairly interesting, and some of you out there may know that I'm fascinated by cemetery landscape and spend a lot of time in the cemeteries. We usually think of family plots. They're very practical people. They bury people according to when they die. And so you'll go by years and by months up and down the burial plot. You may find a husband here and a wife back here and so forth. They don't bury by family plot, but they make use of all of the space rather than having empty spaces that we find in our cemetery. So it's a very compact cemetery layout, but it's done by time of death rather than family connection. And that ends this particular area of Appalachia. Are there any questions that any of you have about Appalachia? Okay, if not, we want to go on to the next area, and the next area is the South. The South. And the South is kind of difficult to deal with because if you look at the two chapters that are included in the Changing South, one is the Traditional South and one is the Southern Coastland, the Changing South overlaps the Southern Coastlands. So what we're going to do is to look at the Changing South, cover almost everything in it, and then pick up only the things we need to along the coast in this area of the Southern Coastlands. So most of it will be spent on the Traditional South that is changing. After these two, we will have a test. So keep in mind, we'll have a test coming up after the series of slides on the South. Okay, the map. This refers to the Traditional South. Now, as you look at this map, I would like you to note that one area that really was not included in the South was Florida. The Traditional South, when we talk about the South, Florida was kind of an exception. You could have gone to Florida and we'd talk about this whole area here, and Florida didn't have it. So looking at Florida, it's kind of out here in a transitional area. It will be covered in the Southern Coastland. And Florida reflects earlier some of the characteristics that have come into the South more recently. As you look at this, you'll see that transitional area of the South. Some of the Southern culture went up into Appalachia. But Appalachia is a region that was separate and distinct, as was the Ozarks. So we've covered this area, and we've covered this area already. Now we're going into the southeastern quadrant of our country. And we're going to look at the physical characteristics. And hopefully by this time, as you're painting sort of your picture, your landscape of the physical geography, you will already have gone back to the initial chapters, pulled out those characteristics, and on your sort of picture that you're developing, have placed the necessary ingredients. In other words, are you going to have hills? What kind of soil are you going to put into it? What kind of climate are you going to have with it? Are you going to have snow down here? What are the characteristics of this region in terms of the physical characteristics? And that's where we have soils, that's where we have terrain, the physiography, all of those that come back and we have to place sort of on the base of our picture. So as you're thinking about this area and this particular area in the Southern Coastlands, and you can see that it's part of the South, the Changing South, is in the Southern Coastlands. And Florida, of course, is in the Southern Coastlands because we're referring to a geographic position, not necessarily a culture region, which is what the South is. So as we look at this and we look at the physiographic characteristics, the climate, the vegetation, the soils, and we have to put that into our landscape that we're developing. As we look at physiography, we see that by and large, Appalachia is excluded. This area here of the Ozarks is excluded. So we have this kind of area right up through here and going like this, but culturally excluding Florida. Florida's in the coastland. So what physiographic region are we in? And it's easy to see that we're in the Gulf Atlantic coastal plain. We're in the coastal plain, an area of sedimentary rock, gently dipping, very little relief, fairly flat. So you put a flat landscape out there on your painting. So paint that flat landscape in. Understand that it's coastal plain, and that characterizes the whole region. And the coastal plain of the south, the next chapter, it'll characterize that. That's one of the items. Next, you look at this and you say, my gosh, I have a climate that characterizes this area. It goes into Appalachia, truly, but Appalachia, even though it has this climate, doesn't have the flatness. And this particular area, you'll see, is CFA. That means it is a humid mesothermal climate with hot summers and very, very mild winters. Now, what can you do with flat land, humid land, a land that is very mild temperature-wise in the winter, and in terms of precipitation, never really dry? Now, there can be exceptions. You know, we just lived through Atlanta, Georgia, having a drought, and that was very unusual. We've just lived through more recently flooding in Atlanta, Georgia. So as we look at this, we know that weather pattern can change year by year, but what we're saying is climatically, this area is humid. Dryness does not characterize this area. Flatness characterizes warm conditions, winters that are very mild, maybe humid, mild, damp, sure, but not cold. Not cold. So you take those two things and then you say, well, what about precipitation? It's humid. How much precipitation are we going to put into this mix? And you come up here and you'll see that we've got 40 to 79 inches of moisture, 40 to 80 inches. Hays, Kansas gets about 22 inches of moisture. Take that 22 inches, multiply it by 4 in some of those areas, and it got a lot of moisture. Very, very moist. You can leave a set of shoes back in the hall closet and it may get green with mildew. You know, you can have a house and let a good air circulation underneath it. You're going to have humidity problems, dampness problems, because this area is damp. And if you add damp and heat together, you could have problems with water. You could have problems with bacterial growth. You could have problems with your homes. You know, as you think about this, this all goes along with it. What could you grow in a place like that? My God, you've got almost year-round growing season. You can do a lot with that, especially down here on the southern margins of it. You've got almost a year-round growing season. Now, keep in mind the changing south doesn't really include the far southern tip of Florida, but the coastlands do. And that does have a tropical climate. You can raise all kinds of tropical things. And if you happen to have a tropical pet and you don't like it, your little pet python gets too big, you just let it loose, and what does it do? It eats chickens, it reproduces, it gets big, it finds a mate, and before long you've got what? All kinds of exotic stuff out there that you hadn't expected. And we're going to find from walking catfishes to pythons to water hyacinths to kudzu. Sometimes they were introduced. But boy, there's all kinds of exotic stuff. Fire ants, you name it, all kinds of good stuff in this kind of climate. Sometimes you give thanks for having coldness, because those things don't sort of live in the cold climate. Fascinating, as we think about global warming in Kansas, things I never saw in the 60s are armadillos. And armadillos are what in Kansas today? Migrating northward. And it won't be long before I'll be cussing out that armadillo in my backyard garden that is creating havoc in my garden, because armadillos are as close as Larned, Kansas. So you think about it, and as we have global warming, all of this stuff here sort of migrates northward in terms of mesothermal. Not necessarily humid, but in terms of mesothermal. Things are getting warmer. So we look at this and we say, okay, we look at that physical thing and we start thinking about all these components. Finally, as we look at vegetation, we say, well, this is a forested area down through here. Very much a forested area, a subtropical evergreen forest, not necessarily a conifer. There are some conifer trees. There's a lot of pine trees that we find down here in the coastal plain, right along the coast, that like the sandy soil. But an evergreen forest means it may not be a time when the trees totally lose their leaves. The evergreen situation. So you're going to have broadleaf forests down in there, but a different type. Tulips, magnolia, flowering trees, wisteria vines, all kinds of vegetation that you wouldn't find here in the Kansas woodlands. So a different type of tree, live oaks, if you will. All kinds of trees that are more subtropical. And as you look at this, you can see it is primarily subtropical down through here. Because here's the area of Appalachia, the Ozarks being out through here, maybe a little bit, if you will, of the middle latitude deciduous forest, but most of it's subtropical. So you sort of paint that picture of the winters and the springs and the trees, really pretty things down through there. And here's a picture from the air of a deciduous evergreen forest, some of it being conifers, some of it changing colors, found down in the southern U.S. The mangrove swamps along the coast, exotic type trees. Far cry from Maine, remember the bypass east and what it looked like there? We're much further south. Neat thing about our country is we have this diversity, so much diversity. The palmetto, and the palmetto that you see in Florida, the palmetto and possibly an area of higher ground in here to allow conifers or deciduous tree, called a hammock back in here, a highland hammock, and the palmetto palms out here in the foregrounds. Or the live oaks and the Spanish moss. And I could include tulip trees and magnolia and wisteria and all the other things associated with the South. The South is a kind of a unique physical region of our country, not like anywhere else. And then you take that unique physical region and you put somewhat of a unique culture on top of it, and that allows you to really get excited about moving through the South and traveling in the South. Sawgrass, that coastal vegetation, this is there in the Everglades. And the soils, notice primarily ultisols, soils that have been fully weathered, and ultisols are often characterized by a reddish color. That iron and aluminum oxides that concentrate in the soils, giving it a red color rather than a brown, black color that you're more familiar with. With proper fertilization, you can use this soil, but it has to have proper fertilization. It's an ultisol, heavily weathered, fully weathered soil. Distinctive regional characteristics. I put these up. I'm not going to say this is all of them, but why do we say the South has a distinctive culture? And you look at that and you begin to say, my gosh, look at that list of items that if you went into this portion of the United States, you'd find in greater abundance than you would find in other places. And you'd find the origins of some things here that have diffused into United States culture in general. So it's a wonderful place to visit. It's an area of pine woods. I mentioned the pine woods. And the pine woods we're going to find are used for tapping, for naval stores. They're being used for pulpwood. They're fast growing. Kudzu, an exotic vine that they brought in. It even becomes so pronounced that there is a comic strip called Kudzu. And it's part of the culture of that area. Broad porched framed houses. Houses with porches that surround the house where people could sit out in their rocking chairs and get away from the heat of the house when the summertime came and the humidity was high and you didn't have air conditioning, you wanted to sit outside. Foods that are never ending. Southern foods are distinctive. We're going to show you a few of them. Stock car racing, NASCAR developed in the South and moved out of there. The Crossroads grocery store, this thing that's called a grocery. Music, blues, gospel, to some extent jazz. Jazz is more out in New Orleans, but particularly, but blues and gospel music associated with the South. A strong family structure. I have a close friend with a person who comes from Georgia. I go down and visit him every year, spend a week in Georgia with him. And his family is so close, it's hard to believe. He moved up to Manhattan, Kansas. He and his wife got a job there, and before he was there for a few years, couldn't have been there more than 5 years, the whole family had moved up to be with him. He'd moved back down to Georgia, the whole family had moved back down to Georgia. They're very close-knit families in the South. Now, when we say these generalizations, there's always exceptions. And individuals would not show the perception that I'm given, but this is a general characteristic. Language and names, use of two names for women or men. Language, there's a characteristic twang to their language that identifies them as Southerners. Veneration of women. Gone with the Wind venerates women, and you think of what women did in the South in the plantation days, the genteel aspect of the woman, putting her up on a pedestal, saying, because you're up on a pedestal, there's certain things you can't do, giving rise to Virginia Slim commercials that said, you've come a long way, baby, when those were big. You know, there's this veneration of women. And it's part of the Bible Belt. What religious group? The Baptists, as we've already seen. The Baptist religion identifies this area of the South. So looking at this, there's a lot of distinctive characteristics. Here's three things that you can't get away from the South. You go in the South, this identifies the South. Moon pies. How many of you had a moon pie? One person out of Chattanooga, that area. It's full of, oh boy, it's full of energy. Nothing but sweet, isn't it? It's just sugar, all kinds of marshmallows between two pieces of cookies, if you will, and you can have double moon pies. Oh, have that with an RC Cola, and it's got to be RC, even though Coke started in the South, and Coke is associated with the area of Georgia. It's got to be Royal Crown when you look at it. And boy, you can't live in the morning without buttermilk biscuits or cornmeal or grits, and Martha White, one of the major names of Southern cooking. And we can go on and on and on with distinctive foodways that are found in the South. Now, if you're in the Great Plains, we have distinctive food too. Right? I was reading the other day, we're going to end today, about distinctive food. I was reading in the New York Times about the pork loins. And it said pork loins are terrible things to eat. They're hard to cook, they dry out, they're hard to take care of. And said along the Mississippi Valley, what they did with pork loin was to make what? You'd have a pork loin sandwich, primarily in the area of the Mississippi Valley and just a little bit to the west. They'd beat that piece of meat down, They'd bread it, fry it, put it on a sandwich, and you'd have a pork tenderloin. How many of you have eaten pork tenderloins? If you've eaten pork tenderloins, though, they're only associated with a small area of the country. They're not found all over. You don't really get pork tenderloins in the South. You get pork in a lot of other ways. Sort of the geography of food, which is another one of my fascinations, and unfortunately, I eat too much of the good stuff, and then I have to watch it. So let's end today. All of you go out and have a pork tenderloin or whatever, and we'll come back and look at Southern food next time.